Despite Chiang Kai-shek's efforts to repair the Kuomintang by leaving for Japan, he could not quell the anger that was forming from the Wuhan nationalist government's violent purge of the communists from their left-center government. The violence emboldened local communists who, on August 1st, 1927, founded the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, and attacked and seized the city of Nanchang in the Nanchang Uprising, forcing the Nationalist Army to divert resources away from the Northern Expedition to secure the city. Once the much larger Nationalist Army was approaching Nanchang, the force of 20,000 PLA soldiers escaped and retreated into hiding in the dense Jinggang Mountains to further organize, with this event marking the official start of the Chinese Civil War, although its implications were not clear yet. In December of that year, another communist uprising would occur, this time in Guangzhou, but which was quickly put down. Conspiracies began to spread within the Kuomintang that Wang Jingwei had allowed the Guangzhou uprising to occur since he was secretly a communist sympathizer. The rumors got bad enough that he was forced to step down, allowing Chiang Kai-shek to return from Japan and once again take control of the nationalist forces. By this time, Wellington Koo had stepped down as interim president of the Beiyang government and appointed general of the National Pacification Army Zhang Zuolin as his successor. By the end of winter in May of 1928, Chiang Kai-shek was ready to resume the northern expedition, with his eyes set on the Shandong Peninsula. While the Shandong was not ultimately handed over to Japan following Germany's defeat in World War I, there did remain a large Japanese presence in the province for commercial purposes, in addition to small armies of Japanese soldiers assisting the Beiyang government in the area. On May 3rd, the nationalists began laying siege on the capital city of Shandong, Jinan, causing the Beiyang forces to retreat and allowing the Kuomintang to enter the city. Chiang Kai-shek quickly promised all Japanese civilians residing in Jinan safe travel out of the city, but by the next day, this promise had been broken. After reading a headline disparaging the Kuomintang in a local Jinan newspaper, which was Japanese owned, a group of national soldiers broke into the newspaper offices and shot the editor. Outraged, a group of Japanese soldiers stationed in Jinan then broke into a government building that the Kuomintang were using as an embassy for the Japanese and killed the top Chinese diplomat there out of revenge. The killing of the diplomat caused further tension, with 15 Japanese civilians being killed in what became known as the Jinan Incident. In response to the killings of their citizens, the Japanese soldiers began shelling Jinan with mortars unannounced, killing at least 6,000 Chinese civilians. The bombardment forced Chiang Kai-shek to abandon Jinan and continue his push north, allowing the city to be occupied by the Japanese in the meantime. During this occupation, any resident sympathizing with the nationalist cause would be executed. The following month, a Chinese national living in Kobe, Japan, would purchase a gun and open fire on a crowd of Japanese civilians, killing 7 before killing himself. In a telegraph message sent to a friend immediately before the attack, he blamed the Jinan incident as the reason he committed the heinous act. As the nationalist forces inched closer to Beijing, Zhang Zuolin began a counteroffensive with the National Pacification Army, but he was unfortunately overwhelmed by the nationalists and was forced to flee by train northeast of Manchuria along with his top officers. Receiving word from the Beiyang government that their allies were fleeing the capital, Japanese forces stationed in Manchuria placed explosives along the track in a small station outside of Mukden, which they planned to detonate as Zhang Zuolin's train passed by in order to assassinate him. The Japanese soldiers there believed that the Beiyang government was already a lost cause, and that if they went ahead and assassinated Zhang Zuolin, then he wouldn't be able to set up a government in exile in Manchuria, which would allow Japan to take it. When Zhang Zuolin's train arrived at the station, it did in fact detonate, creating a massive explosion known as the Huanggatun incident, with the president being killed in the explosion. The effects of the assassination, however, did not go as planned, as it soon became clear that the assassination was not carried out with prior approval from officials within the Japanese government, creating widespread outrage both internationally and domestically, forcing Japan to avoid any more current efforts to take Manchuria. Zhang Zuolin's son Cheng Shui Liang followed his father as president of the Beiyang government and quickly entered into negotiations with the Kuomintang, having all Beiyang Republic flags lowered and replaced with the nationalist flag, officially ending the Beiyang government and beginning the unified Republic of China, with Chiang Kai-shek in charge, marking an end to the fractured nature of the warlord era and beginning the so-called Nanjing Decade due to the nationalist capital being moved to Nanjing. Right away, Chiang Kai shek aimed to create a functioning centralized Republican government which would help modernize China, but which was no easy task convincing the regional warlords to peacefully relinquish their powers to raise an army and tax. Following the collapse of the Beiyang government, Japan agreed to return Shandong, but gave control to a former Beiyang warlord named Zhang Zongchang, who then refused to give up his powers to the central government, causing the nationalist forces to invade the Shandong province in January of 1929, crushing the rebellion in a matter of months and regaining control of the territory. In light of the rebellion, Chiang Kai shek ordered the rapid disarmament of the nationalist army forces to avoid any future bloody power struggles, but this call for disarmament instead caused several warlords, weary of giving up control, to ally against the Kuomintang, declaring war on them in March that year, beginning the Central Plains War. For his earlier allegiance to the Kuomintang, Cheng Shui-liang was given the position of governor of Manchuria, which would exist as a semi-autonomous province with its own northeastern army. While the Central Plains War was initially going poorly for the nationalist forces, Cheng Shui-liang came to the rescue with the Northeastern Army, defeating the warlords, which would allow nationalists to focus on forming the government and containing various communist insurgencies popping up in the more rural territories. These insurgencies would form self-recognized states called Soviets, based off the system being used in the USSR, and the nationalists had to constantly work to dislodge them. In 1930, at the prodding of British officials, the Dalai Lama, sensing the relative weakness of China at the time, launched an invasion of the Sichuan province. From the Tibetans had long coveted, easily overwhelming the local forces there. The Tibetan army did not anticipate that Chiang Kai-shek would react so fiercely, and after sending the combined nationalist army, the Tibetans were defeated and forced back to their homeland. To forge a new sense of national Chinese identity, Chiang Kai shek instituted many reforms, including making standard Mandarin the national language, supporting the rural reconstruction movement, which aimed to repair the social structure of rural villages, and with the help of First Lady Suong Mei Ling, founded the New Life movement, which many describe today as a fascist version of Confucian ideals. They formed the Blue Shirt Society to propel the movement, which was reminiscent of Hitler and his efforts to spread Nazism in Germany. Chiang Kai shek and the nationalist government would actually have good relations with Germany due to these common ideologies up until World War II, when the Nazis allied with their arch enemies, the Japanese. Most importantly, he espoused the ideology created by his mentor Sun Yat sen, known as Tridentism, which believes that the combined ideals of democracy, republicanism, science, constitutionalism, and nationalism are required to maintain a strong modern state. In 1931, his efforts would be greatly tested as Japan once again looked to capture Manchuria. In July of that year, Chinese farmers in Manchuria got in a dispute with Korean farmers who were given permission to lease territory in Manchuria to farm. The Koreans, being subjects of the Japanese, received their funding to help improve their farming efficiency, chiefly by digging new irrigation canals. One of these canals accidentally crossed over onto a Chinese farmer's property, and he complained to the authorities, and they had the Koreans expelled for infringing on the man's property rights. Although a minor occurrence, the dispute was widely sensationalized in Japanese news, becoming known as the Wan Paoshan incident, which quickly turned public sentiment further against the Chinese, making an invasion more politically palpable. On top of this, back in April of that year, a full-on rebellion erupted in the always testy Xinjiang province. The previous governor of Xinjiang, Yang Jiangxin, was killed in a failed coup by one of his advisors. Jin Shuren was one of Yang Jiangxin's closest followers, and his assassination enraged him to the point he seized power and purged any officials he suspected of being involved in the assassination of his mentor. He dismantled the Kamul Khanate, which was a semi-autonomous state that had existed since the beginning of the Qing dynasty, and which had given the Uyghur Muslim majority population there more freedoms to practice their religion. Jin Shuren was ethnic Han and was notoriously brutal in his racist attacks against the Uyghur Muslim majority population, sparking the Kamul Rebellion. Jin Shuren and his Xinjiang clique continued to conspire with the USSR in undermining the nationalist government, angering Chiang Kai-shek, so he actively began supporting the Uyghurs in the request to overthrow Jin Shuren. Sensing an opportunity to destabilize northwestern China, Japan, the UK, and the Kingdom of Afghanistan assisted young Turk radicals from Turkey in attempting to turn Xinjiang into an independent Turkic state free from Chinese influence, and they joined the rebellion, turning it into a three-way fight in the name of establishing East Turkestan, with fighting continuing on for several years. Then in September, the largely forgotten former Emperor Puyi, who was living as a commoner, wrote the Japanese Minister of War expressing his interest in being restored to the throne, re-kickstarting Japanese efforts to take Manchuria. In a repeat of earlier events, Japanese soldiers staged a false flag operation known as the Mukden Incident, in which they would blow up a portion of the nearby railway and blame it on local communist Chinese rebels, giving them a justification for the invasion. This time, the explosion was a dud, failing to even dismantle the tracks as a train passed by without error a few minutes later. Despite this failure, the Japanese army decided to go through with the plan, fabricating evidence to make it appear as if the explosion was instead quite large. Right after declaring publicly that they would invade Manchuria to restore order, Japan crossed the border from occupied Korea and began their assault by bombarding the Northeast Army's main base, destroying their entire air force. Chiang Kai shek began to draw public anger as he continued to push for the idea that the real threat were the communists and that they needed to be defeated before China could take on Japan. This line of thinking was exactly what caused a majority of the Northeast Army to be deployed outside of Manchuria, allowing the territory to fall to Japan in a matter of months, which pressured Chiang Kai shek to step down from the presidency for a year. Puyi then traveled in secrecy in the trunk of a car and then by boat to Manchuria, where he was greeted by Japanese soldiers who proclaimed him the Emperor of Manchukuo, the name for Manchuria now that it was their puppet state. To Puyi's dismay, his Japanese handler set him up in a luxurious hotel as his palace, but refused him to ever leave, with the stated reason to avoid him being assassinated. With the optics of a Chinese emperor, the Japanese aimed to create Manchukuo into a pan-Asian utopian society where ethnic Japanese, Han, Manchu, Mongol, and Korean people all would live together under Japanese ideals, with propaganda calling the effort the five races under one nation. At this point, the commercial center of Shanghai had been continuously occupied by foreign merchants since the Second Opium War, who had combined their occupation zones into what they called the Shanghai International Settlement, which would be open to free trade with any nation. Japanese soldiers stationed in the city upon hearing news of the annexation of Manchukuo became zealous and, along with Japanese Buddhist monks in the city, began to taunt the Chinese residents incessantly, to the point an angry mob of Chinese finally broke and attacked one of the monks, killing them. The Japanese soldiers stationed in Shanghai then rioted, burning down a factory and neighborhood, killing two Chinese. Heavy fighting lasted a month and was only stopped due to a ceasefire agreement brokered by the League of Nations, which demilitarized Shanghai, something that allowed the local communists to gain the upper hand and establish the Fujian People's Government, although the rebellion was quickly toppled by the Kuomintang and consequently allowed Chiang Kai-shek to return to power so order could be restored. The entire ordeal in Shanghai was an embarrassment for Japan and led to public opinion turning against the president there, and served as a major reason he was assassinated a few months later and replaced with a military regime hell bent on conquering Asia. By October of 1939, Chiang Kai shek and the Nationalist Army were badly defeating the communist insurgents and closing in on them. Out of desperation, the communists under General Mao Zedong planned a daring escape attempt to retreat north into the central Chinese mountains and set up a remote base of operations for the winter. The escape would become known as the Long March, and of the 65,000 communists that traveled with Mao, only 8,000 arrived to the mountain town of Yan'an alive, which was the intended final destination. With the communist threat apparently neutralized, many in the government believed Chiang Kai shek would finally turn his focus to Japan, but by 1936 he was still just as fixated on eradicating the communists. Cheng Shui-liang was especially frustrated with Chiang Kai-shek, since it was his governing territory that was lost to the Japanese. So, along with top Northeastern Army officials, he carried out a clandestine plan known as the Xi'an Incident, where they kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek and held him hostage while he was swimming in a hot pool at a mountain resort in Xi'an. The coup instigators refused to let Chiang Kai-shek go until he agreed to officially pause the civil war by forming a second united front alliance with the communists and focusing their collective strength on the Japanese, as well as to enter into a non-aggression pact with the USSR, who was also weary of Japan attempting to seize their port of Vladivostok. The relationship would be short-lived, and within a month the Soviets had broken their promise of peace and stepped up their support for the Xinjiang clique in their ongoing suppression of the Uyghurs, contributing to a major escalation in fighting, which would result in the province of Xinjiang falling to the Soviets. This intervention by Chiang Shui-Liang proved consequential, as in July of 1937, a dispute arose at the town of Wanping, located on the border between the Republic of China and Manchukuo. The town had a large bridge which crossed the Yangding River, the basis of the border, and was known as Marco Polo Bridge due to its prominent feature in the narrative of Marco Polo's journey through Asia. Both sides of the border were heavily militarized and patrolled. One night, a Japanese army soldier who was standing guard suddenly felt a bout of violent diarrhea coming on. In desperation, he abandoned his post and sprinted off into the woods to defecate. When his officers discovered he was missing, they called a search and quickly began to suspect the soldier had defected to the Chinese. The forces sent a message to the mayor of Wanping demanding immediate access to search the town for the missing soldier, but he refused. In response, the Japanese began to prepare to shell the city, despite the fact that the soldier soon returned and explained to his superiors what had happened. The wheels of war were already in motion. In the following month, Japan sent in a large army of 300,000 to invade the port city of Shanghai, using an amphibious assault, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. Over the next 3 months, the Chinese and Japanese armies would fight viciously in the Battle of Shanghai, which was largely reminiscent of the later World War II Battle of Stalingrad in its urban setting. At first, the Chinese forces worked meticulously to clear Japanese soldiers from the downtown Shanghai, going street to street, securing them by erecting large sandbag barriers. Japanese soldiers began kidnapping Chinese civilians to use as human shields, which proved disastrous when the Chinese did an aerial bombing of the Great World, a Western-styled entertainment complex in downtown Shanghai, which was being used as a base for the Japanese, unknowingly killing 3,000 civilian hostages in the process. The initial success of the Chinese resistance began to fade as more and more waves of Japanese soldiers arrived on shore. Within a month, the Japanese had secured downtown and pushed the Chinese into the surrounding residential areas. Another month, and the Chinese were rapidly retreating to the capital city of Nanjing, allowing Shanghai, China's largest city, to fall into Japanese hands. Although they had won the battle, many of the Japanese soldiers became demoralized or angry that they had not been able to capture Shanghai in a matter of days instead of it taking weeks. This loss of honor, in addition to the costly interactions with the retreating Chinese guerrilla fighters, meant that the Japanese army was not as superior as they had thought, and it led to many of the soldiers to begin taking a more brutal approach in how they interacted with civilians and prisoners of war.